On the blistering afternoon of September 14, 1944, the sun hung like a molten weight over the Imperial ridges, where the heat inside the limestone caves spiked past 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Corporal Ichiro Arakawa watched through a narrow firing slit as the men of the 1st Marine Division scrambled below, their uniforms blackened with sweat and coral dust. For 3 days, the Americans had been hunted by an invisible enemy, losing men to precise fire from the shadows of the ridges. But as a Marine sergeant raised his M3 binoculars to scan the cliffs, he saw it, a sharp, unmistakable glint of light reflecting off a glass lens. To the Americans, it was the aha moment that would save their lives, a tactical breakthrough studied in military academies for a century. What they didn't know was that Arakawa was smiling. In his hand he held not a sniper scope, but a jagged shard of a broken mirror. The miracle detection method the Americans just discovered was actually a death sentence meticulously written by the Japanese. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The invasion of Peleliu was projected to be a short 4-day affair. Military planners promised the Marines that naval bombardment would shatter all resistance. However, they had not accounted for Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. Abandoning the traditional banzai charges, Nakagawa turned the island into a subterranean honeycomb of over 500 caves. Corporal Ichiro Arakawa was the architect of this specific shadow war. While his comrades stayed deep in the limestone, Arakawa realized that the Americans were becoming optically obsessed. He noted in his logs that the Marines had stopped looking for muzzle flashes and started looking for the sun's reflection on Japanese glass. On the morning of September 14th, Arakawa gathered his team. They weren't armed with Type 99 Arisaka rifles yet. They were armed with crates of shattered Type 93 binocular lenses and polished metal scraps. If they want to see us, Arakawa told his men, we will give them 1,000 eyes to look at. And while they stare at the light, we will fire from the dark. The Marines, led by Sergeant Hartman, were elite marksmen trained at Camp Pendleton. They understood light and trajectory. But they were about to learn a lesson that wasn't in the manual. On Peleliu, the most visible target is often the only one that isn't real. The air inside the limestone cave was a stagnant soup of sweat, cordite, and the metallic tang of damp coral. It was late on the evening of September 13, 1944, and the Imperial ridges were unnervingly silent, save for the distant, rhythmic thud of U.S. Navy shells tenderizing the coastline. Corporal Ichiro Arakawa sat hunched over a low wooden table, his face illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a single tallow candle. Before him lay the blueprint for the defense of Peleliu, a masterpiece of attrition designed by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. Arakawa's finger traced the jagged contours of the Fukaku defensive lines, a subterranean honeycomb of 500 interconnected caves. Nakagawa's orders were revolutionary and cold. There would be no glorious banzai charges. Every man was to stay in the shadows and kill 10 Americans before falling. But as Arakawa looked at the maps, a gnawing doubt settled in his chest. Invisibility was a static defense, and the 1st Marine Division was proving to be a dynamic hunter. Earlier that day, from a hidden observation post near the Five Brothers Peaks, Arakawa had watched through his Type 97 sniper scope as a Marine scout team operated below. He didn't just see their movements, he saw their evolution. They were no longer blindly rushing into the brush. Instead, they were stationary, using their M3 binoculars to scan the ridges with agonizing patience. He realized the Americans were no longer looking for soldiers. They were looking for anomalies. The slight shimmer of a lens, the unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel, or the momentary glint of a watch face. The realization hit him with the force of a naval bombardment. If the Marines were looking for reflections, they would eventually find them. No matter how much camouflaging soot they applied to their Type 99 Arisaka barrels, a single mistake would reveal a bunker that housed 50 men. To stay hidden was to be a sitting duck. To survive, Arakawa realized he had to stop trying to be invisible and start being obvious in all the wrong places. He reached into his rucksack and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound logbook, scrawling a single phrase in kanji, Kyogi no Hayatiki, false targets. He looked toward the rear of the cave, where a crate of damaged equipment sat in the shadows, salvaged from a supply depot hit by a Hellcat strafing run. Inside were shattered Type 93 binocular sets and cracked periscope mirrors, useless for seeing but perfect for being seen. Arakawa's plan was a dark inversion of traditional Japanese Bushido. He wouldn't just hide his men. He would build a phantom army made of light and glass. He began to calculate the sun's azimuth for the following morning, plotting exactly when the rays would hit the eastern face of the Umberbergal. He knew the Marines were already setting up their grid-scanning teams, confident that their broken glass method would lead them to victory. As Arakawa picked up a jagged shard of mirror, he didn't see a piece of trash. He saw a lure. He stepped toward the cave entrance, the humid Pacific night air hitting his face, and looked down at the flickering campfires of the American beachhead. He knew Sergeant Hartman's team was out there, eyes pressed to their optics, waiting for a single mistake. Arakawa reached out and placed the shard into a crevice in the coral, angling it with the precision of a watchmaker. But as the first hint of pre-dawn light began to gray the horizon, he heard a sound that wasn't supposed to be there. A metallic click from the darkness just 20 yards below his invisible position, followed by a whisper in English that made his blood run cold. By 8 o'clock hours on September 14, 1944, the white glare of the sun reflecting off the jagged coral of the Umberbergal ridges was already enough to sear the retinas of any man foolish enough to scan the horizon without squinting. From his recessed spider hole, a position carved into the limestone and draped with a masterfully woven net of desiccated jungle vines, Corporal Ichiro Arakawa remained motionless. He was a part of the rock itself, his Type 99 Arisaka rifle resting on a padded sandbag, its bolt handle blackened with soot to kill any telltale shine. A few hundred yards below, in a shallow depression choked with heat-warped scrub, he spotted them, Sergeant Hartman's reconnaissance team. Through his Type 97 sniper optics, Arakawa watched the Americans. They were exhausted, their faces smeared with the gray dust of Paliliu, but there was a new, focused energy in their movements. He watched as a young Marine, PFC Riley, pointed a shaking finger toward a ridge line to Arakawa's left. The boy had seen it. Arakawa shifted his gaze slightly to the west, where a junior spotter in an adjacent cave had committed a fatal error. The man had moved his Type 93 binoculars too quickly, and for a fraction of a second, the morning sun had struck the objective lens at a 90-degree angle. It was a brilliant, needle-sharp flash of light that sliced through the shimmering heat haze like a signal flare. Arakawa didn't move to help his comrade. He simply watched, his heart beating with a slow, rhythmic thud. He saw Sergeant Hartman grab a pair of M3 binoculars, his body tensing as he adjusted the focus. Beside him, a Marine with a photographer's eye, the one the others called Kowalski, was nodding vigorously, sketching a rapid grid map on a sweat-stained clipboard. The Americans were talking, their gestures animated. They thought they had found the ghost's weakness. They were convinced that the key to surviving the ridges lay in hunting these tiny, accidental beacons of light. Arakawa could almost hear the logic forming in Hartman's mind. If it glints, it's a target. If we map the glints, we map the enemy. It was a beautiful, logical, and entirely American conclusion. They were engineers of war, looking for a mechanical solution to a psychological problem. Arakawa felt a surge of cold, intellectual pride. By allowing that one real glint to be discovered, he had given the Marines a truth to believe in. He watched as Hartman signaled for a runner, likely to relay the coordinates of the spotted sniper to the 75mm pack howitzer's position near the beachhead. The Marines began to move with a newfound swagger, their rifles held ready as they systematically scanned the next sector of the limestone face. They were no longer looking for the Japanese, they were looking for the glass. Arakawa reached down and touched the burlap sack at his feet, filled with the mirror shards he had prepared the night before. He had intended to wait until evening to begin the deception, but as he watched the Americans grow bolder, he realized the discovery was unfolding faster than he had anticipated. He began to crawl backward into the cooling darkness of the tunnel network, intent on repositioning his mirror smiths to match the Americans' grid-scanning pace. But as he reached the first junction of the damp limestone corridor, a sharp, concussive blast rocked the cave ceiling, showering him in white dust. It wasn't an American shell. It was a demolition charge, detonated from within their own tunnel system. Someone was sealing the exits, and as Arakawa turned to see who had triggered the blast, he realized that Colonel Nakagawa's orders for total defense might include a terrifying price he hadn't accounted for. By 1645 hours on September 14th, the shadows of the Umberbergal ridges began to stretch across the coral flats like long, dark fingers reaching for the sea. The oppressive 115 degrees Fahrenheit heat had not broken, but the quality of the light was shifting, turning from a harsh white glare to a deep, deceptive gold. Corporal Ichiro Arakawa moved through the narrow, humid arteries of the tunnel system, his boots crunching on loose limestone. Behind him, two privates carried heavy burlap sacks, their contents clinking with a crystalline sound that seemed out of place in a theater of war. They reached a series of jagged apertures, natural fissures in the coral that overlooked the American 1st Marine Division's precarious positions. Arakawa checked his military issue watch. In 15 minutes, the sun would hit the optimal azimuth. He reached into the first sack and pulled out a handful of jagged glass, shards from a shattered Type 93 binocular set and polished aluminum strips salvaged from a downed Mitsubishi A6M0. To the Americans below, these were the discarded remnants of a broken army. To Arakawa, they were the components of a lethal optical illusion. With the patience of a master watchmaker, Arakawa began the work. He didn't just toss the glass into the crevices. He wedged each shard into the porous coral at precise angles, calculating the refraction of the 1700-hour sun. He knew that Sergeant Hartman's marksmen were currently hunkered down with their M3 binoculars, their eyes straining against the heat haze to find the glint that signaled a Japanese sniper. Position the larger shards in the empty crevices of the Five Brothers Peak, Arakawa whispered to his men, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of U.S. Navy 16-inch shells. Leave the real firing ports dark. The Americans must believe they have caught us being careless. One by one, the mirror smiths created a constellation of false targets. They placed a cracked lens in a cave mouth that was too shallow to hold a man, and a strip of polished steel near a dummy pillbox made of painted coconut logs. By 1700 hours, the trap was set. As the sun hit the horizon's edge, the ridges erupted in a silent, shimmering display. To an observer on the ground, it looked as though 40 Japanese snipers had simultaneously raised their optics to scan the beachhead. Arakawa retreated into the deep shadow of a real reinforced bunker, his Type 99 Arisaka rifle held loosely in his lap. He watched through a 3-inch wide slit as the American lines suddenly erupted in activity. He saw the frantic movement of runners and the glint of Hartman's own glass as the Marines began marking their maps, falling over themselves to record the coordinates of the siren's glints. They were confident. They were excited. They were exactly where Arakawa needed them to be. But as Arakawa scanned the American perimeter for the inevitable artillery signal, his breath caught. In the center of the valley, a single Marine, a man he hadn't noticed before, was not looking at the ridges with binoculars. He was standing perfectly still, holding a long black instrument that looked nothing like standard scout gear. As the man turned the device toward Arakawa's hidden position, a strange rhythmic clicking sound began to echo from the valley floor, a sound that bypassed the deception of the mirrors and seemed to pulse with a terrifying, mechanical intelligence. The hours between the 1700 hours glints and the fall of true darkness on September 14th were the most agonizing for the men of the 2nd Infantry Regiment. Inside the suffocating limestone depths of the Ymerbergal, Corporal Ichiro Arakawa enforced a discipline of absolute silence. Not a bolt was cycled, not a canteen cap was unscrewed. The Japanese defenders had become part of the geological record, their breathing shallow and synchronized with the heavy, humid pulse of the island. Through his spotting slit, Arakawa watched the American response to his mirror-smith deception. The valley floor was a hive of frantic, misplaced industry. He observed Sergeant Hartman huddled over a map board, his grease pencil flying across a translucent overlay. Beside him, runners from the 1st Marine Division, young men with their sleeves rolled up and their M1 Garand slung low, waited for the sighting data. Each time one of Arakawa's mirror shards caught a dying ray of light, a runner was dispatched, sprinting through the coral dust to relay the coordinates of a confirmed enemy sniper. Arakawa watched as the Americans used their SR 536 handy-talkie radios, the antennas bobbing as they called in the locations of ghosts. They were building a masterpiece of fiction. On their maps, the ridges were now teeming with Japanese marksmen. In reality, those sectors were occupied only by jagged rock and shattered glass. The Marines were falling into the classic trap of confirmation bias. They had a theory that the Japanese were careless with their optics, and Arakawa was providing all the evidence they needed to believe it. The psychological shift was palpable even from 300 yards away. The tension that had gripped the Marines for days was being replaced by a dangerous, predatory confidence. Arakawa saw Private Riley laughing as he pointed toward the Five Brothers Peaks, likely joking about how easy the next morning's assault would be. They thought they had seen the invisible man's shadow. They didn't realize the shadow was a puppet. Let them map every spark, Arakawa whispered to himself, his hand resting on the cool wood of his Type 99 Arisaka. The more they believe they see, the less they will look at the darkness between the lights. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging Peleliu into a bruised purple twilight. The glints vanished, leaving the Marines with a completed map of 43 targets. As the first American star shells began to illuminate the night sky, casting flickering, ghostly shadows across the coral, Arakawa noticed a change in the American camp. The runners had stopped moving and a heavy, armored silence was settling over the beachhead. Just as Arakawa prepared to rotate his watch, he spotted a lone Marine officer standing near a landed LVT-4 Buffalo, unrolling a fresh set of aerial photographs that had just arrived from a reconnaissance flight. Photographs that, if high enough in resolution, might reveal that the snipers the Marines had mapped didn't have bodies attached to them. The moonless night of September 14th transitioned into a pre-dawn haze that smelled of sulfur and salt. Inside the limestone command center, Corporal Ichiro Arakawa felt the atmosphere shift. Through his Type 97 optics, he observed a troubling hesitation in the American lines. Near a parked M4 Sherman tank, Sergeant Hartman was staring at the ridges, his brow furrowed as he compared the glint map to a fresh set of aerial reconnaissance photos. The Americans were analytical. They were starting to wonder why 43 elite snipers would all be foolish enough to catch the sun at the exact same hour. The deception was hovering on the edge of collapse. To keep the Marines on the hook, Arakawa knew he had to feed them a drop of real blood. He turned to Private Sato, a young soldier stationed in a minor peripheral observation post, a shallow, poorly reinforced crevice on the lower eastern slope. It was a disposable position, disconnected from the main tunnel network. Arakawa's voice was devoid of emotion as he gave the order. Sato was to wait until 6:30 hours, when the sun first crested the ridges, and purposefully expose his Type 93 binoculars. But unlike the mirrors, Sato was to fire exactly one round from his Type 99 Arisaka at the American perimeter before retreating into the deep recesses of the hole. At 6:32 the trap was sprung. A brilliant, authentic flash of light erupted from Sato's position, followed by the sharp, whip-crack report of a 7.7 mm round. The bullet thudded into a sandbag inches from PFC Riley's head. The American camp exploded into a choreographed frenzy of violence. Arakawa watched as Hartman pointed triumphantly at the puff of smoke. "There. Sector 4, just like the glint said," the sergeant bellowed, his voice carrying over the humid air. Within minutes, the Marines called in a strike. Two M4A3R3 Zippo flame tanks lumbered forward, their long projectors spewing liquid fire into Sato's crevice. The limestone turned black as the napalm-thick fuel incinerated everything within the small cave. Arakawa watched the fire consume his subordinate without blinking. Below him, the Marines were cheering. Their doubt had vanished, replaced by a dangerous, ironclad certainty. They had proven that the glints were real, that their method worked, and that the Japanese were vulnerable. As the smoke from Sato's funeral pyre drifted toward the sea, Hartman began signaling the 1st Marine Division to prepare for a full-scale infantry assault. They were moving into the kill zone Arakawa had prepared, convinced they were walking into a graveyard of neutralized targets. Arakawa reached for his radio to signal the hidden heavy machine gun nests, but as he keyed the transmitter, the device emitted a high-pitched, electronic shriek. It wasn't static, it was a rhythmic, artificial pulse, the same mechanical sound he had heard the night before, and this time, it was coming from inside the walls of his own command bunker. The dawn of September 15, 1944, arrived not with a sunrise, but with a horizon-shattering roar. At exactly 7 o'clock hours, the Naval Task Force anchored off the coast of Peleliu unleashed a preparatory bombardment of staggering proportions. From his deep sanctuary within the Yumurbergal's limestone marrow, Corporal Ichiro Arakawa felt the very mountain groan. The concussion of 14-inch shells from the distant battleships rolled through the rock like a physical weight, vibrating in the teeth of every man in the 2nd Infantry Regiment. Above ground, the broken glass trap was performing its silent, deadly duty. Arakawa had spent the final hours of darkness ensuring his mirror shards were angled to catch the first light of the invasion morning. As the dust from the initial salvos cleared, Sergeant Hartman and the 1st Marine Division observers saw exactly what they expected to see. Dozens of sharp, crystalline flashes erupting across the ridgeline. To the Americans, these were the panicked movements of Japanese snipers exposed by the morning sun. Hartman wasted no time. He signaled the 75mm pack howitzers and the naval fire directors, screaming coordinates that corresponded perfectly with Arakawa's grid of decoys. Arakawa watched through a reinforced periscope as the ridges were systematically pulverized. Thousands of tons of high explosives hammered into the empty limestone crevices, the dummy pillboxes of coconut logs, and the specific coral folds where the mirror shards had been placed. Great plumes of white coral dust and black smoke geysered into the air, obscuring the Five Brothers peaks. To the Marines watching from the beachhead, it was a beautiful sight, a systematic deletion of the enemy's teeth. "They are hitting the ghosts," Arakawa whispered, his voice calm amidst the localized earthquakes. Behind him, his elite marksmen sat in the flickering dimness of the tunnel, their Type 99 Arisaka rifles clean and cold. They were 100 feet below the impact zones, protected by the very Fukaku doctrine Colonel Nakagawa had mastered. The Americans were burning through their ammunition to destroy glass and rock, while the real defenders remained untouched, breathing through bamboo vents and waiting for the iron rain to cease. By 8 o'clock, the bombardment reached a crescendo, a rolling barrage, designed to clear the way for the LVTs now churning toward the orange-tinted sands of Orange Beach. Arakawa saw Sergeant Hartman climbing onto a ridge, waving his arm forward in a gesture of absolute triumph. The Marines were moving out, their rifles at the high port, stepping over the smoking ruins of positions they believed were neutralized. They were walking with the confidence of men who had won the battle before it began. Arakawa signaled his men to move toward the primary firing slits, the dark, unmapped apertures that had remained silent throughout the morning. But as he reached for his own rifle, he noticed something impossible. The high-pitched, rhythmic clicking sound that had plagued his radio the night before wasn't coming from the device anymore. It was coming from the floor of the cave itself, a steady, mechanical thump-thump-thump that was growing louder, as if something massive and metallic was burrowing upward through the solid limestone directly beneath their feet. The silence that followed the lifting of the naval barrage at 8:15 was more suffocating than the thunder had been. As the white coral dust settled over the Ymerbergal ridges, the first wave of the 1st Marine Division began their grim ascent. Sergeant Hartman led the way, his M1 Garand held at the ready, his boots crunching on the pulverized remains of limestone and shattered mirror glass. To his left, PFC Riley checked his bar, his eyes darting toward the blackened crevices they had spent the morning shelling. They moved with the confidence of men walking through a graveyard, certain that the broken glass method had successfully scrubbed the ridges of its defenders. From a hidden aperture no larger than a man's fist, Corporal Ichiro Arakawa watched them enter the basin. He was located 300 yards away from the dummy positions the Americans had just vaporized. His real bunker was a masterpiece of camouflage, draped in chemically treated netting that mimicked the exact gray-white hue of the sun-bleached coral. Behind him, the crew of a Type 92 heavy machine gun, known to the Marines as the Woodpecker for its rhythmic chugging, waited for his signal. The Marines were now deep in the cleared grid sectors, their bodies silhouetted against the blinding white flats of the valley floor. They were perfectly positioned in a natural amphitheater of death. Hartman paused, squinting at a ridge that should have been teeming with snipers, but was now only smoking rock. He signaled for his squad to bunch up near a disabled LVT-4 Buffalo, seeking a moment of shade. They were exposed, exhausted, and utterly convinced they were alone. Arakawa didn't use a whistle or a shout. He simply reached for a signal cord and pulled. High above, a single red flare hissed into the air, its crimson smoke stark against the cloudless Pacific sky. It was the go order for the real defensive network. Suddenly, the ridges that had been silent for hours erupted in a coordinated, overlapping crossfire. The muzzle flashes didn't come from the cave mouths the Americans had mapped. They came from the dead spaces in between, from cracks in the floor, from hollowed-out stalactites, and from hidden slits at ground level that the Marines had walked right past. The first burst from the Type 92 tore through the center of the Marine column. Arakawa watched through his Type 97 scope as the predatory confidence on Hartman's face vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, visceral horror. The broken glass trap had worked too well. By chasing the glints of light, the Americans had ignored the shadows, and now the shadows were firing back. The valley was no longer a battlefield, it was a slaughterhouse. But as the first screams of the wounded began to echo through the limestone corridors, Arakawa's triumph was cut short. The mechanical thump-thump-thump he had heard earlier intensified, vibrating through the soles of his boots. It wasn't an American counterattack and it wasn't a tunnel collapse. As he looked back toward the rear of the bunker, he saw the limestone floor begin to bulge upward, and a serrated steel bit, something far more advanced than anything in the Japanese or American arsenal, burst through the rock, spinning with a low, electromagnetic hum that made his skin crawl. By 10 o'clock hours on September 15th, the sun was a white-hot hammer pounding the coral floor of the Ymerbergal, but for the survivors of the 1st Marine Division, the heat was secondary to the chilling realization of their own folly. The basin had become a nightmare of crossfire and confusion. Sergeant Hartman lay pinned behind the tread of a charred LVT-4, his face coated in white limestone dust and the crimson spray of his fallen comrades. He looked back at the ridges, at the specific crevices they had spent thousands of rounds neutralizing based on the morning's glints. They remained silent, dead rock. The real fire, the rhythmic, heart-stopping chug-chug-chug of the Type 92 woodpeckers, was coming from the dark, unremarkable spaces in between. The psychological impact was devastating. The Marines hadn't just been outfought, they had been outsmarted. The very clue they had used to bolster their courage, the glint of Japanese glass, had been a siren song leading them into a blind alley. A sense of profound paranoia swept through the ranks. Men began to fire wildly at any spark of light, even the reflection of the sun on a discarded C-ration tin, wasting precious ammunition on a phantom enemy that refused to reveal its true face. In the shallow cover of a coral sinkhole, Private First Class Thomas Riley clutched his grease-stained journal with trembling hands. The entries from the previous days, filled with the hope of a 4-day operation and the excitement of the broken glass method, now looked like the ravings of a ghost. His latest entry, scrawled in jagged, frantic script, captured the total collapse of morale. The lights were lies. Everything we see is a lie. They aren't in the caves, they are the caves. Hartman is screaming for a retreat, but there's nowhere to go. The ridges are watching us with 1,000 fake eyes, and every time we blink, another man disappears into the white dust. Riley looked over the edge of his hole and saw the body of Corporal Martinez, the man who had been hit 3 times already, lying in the open. The realization that they were being systematically harvested by an enemy that used their own ingenuity as a weapon broke something inside the young Bostonian. He stopped checking his bar. He simply sat in the dust, staring at a small shard of mirror glass a few feet away, watching as it caught the light with a mocking, crystalline brilliance. High above, Corporal Ichiro Arakawa watched the disintegration of the American spirit through his Type 97 optics. He saw the woodpecker crews moving with cold efficiency, their positions still untouched by the desperate, uncoordinated American return fire. The broken glass trap had evolved from a tactical maneuver into a psychological weapon of mass destruction. Arakawa reached for his logbook to record the success of the morning's engagement, but his hand froze. The serrated steel bit that had breached the bunker floor earlier was no longer spinning. It had retracted, leaving a perfectly circular hole that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent blue light, a light that shouldn't exist in 1944. From the depths of that hole, a voice began to speak, not in Japanese or English, but in a series of digital tones that matched the coordinates of every Marine still alive in the valley below. By September 16th, the WWII ridges were no longer a tactical objective. They were a monument to the most harrowing psychological defeat of the Pacific Campaign. The broken glass trap had effectively paralyzed the 1st Marine Division's advance for 36 hours, a delay that allowed Colonel Nakagawa's forces to further fortify the Fukaku lines, extending the battle from a projected 4 days into a brutal 2-month siege. When the ridges were finally cleared, the American investigators found the limestone littered not with the bodies of dozens of snipers, but with hundreds of carefully angled shards of Type 93 binocular lenses and strips of polished aluminum. Corporal Ichiro Arakawa's final fate remained a mystery that would haunt military intelligence for decades. His command bunker was found empty, save for a single Type 99 Arisaka rifle leaning against a wall and a leather-bound logbook open to its final page. The entry was not a record of kills, but a series of precise sun angle calculations and a single chilling observation. Visibility is a choice. We chose to let them see their own deaths. There was no trace of the strange, circular breach in the floor or the bioluminescent light. The limestone had been sealed with a demolition charge that had fused the rock into a smooth, glassy obsidian. In the post-war years, the broken glass trap became a mandatory case study at the United States Army Intelligence Center at Fort Huachuca. Military historians classified it as the ultimate counterintelligence feat of the theater. A perfect reflexive control operation where the enemy was fed the exact data they were searching for to manipulate their behavior. Sergeant William Billy Hartman, who survived the war but never spoke of the ridges, reportedly kept a single shard of Poleliu coral on his desk until his death, a reminder of the day light became a weapon. PFC Thomas Riley's journal, recovered by a Navy chaplain, remains in the archives of the Marine Corps Museum. It serves as a grim testament to the siren's glint, documenting how a modern, technologically superior force was dismantled by a primitive deception of light and shadow. The tactic forced a permanent change in U.S. doctrine, leading to the development of the anti-reflective device, ARD, honeycombs used on modern optics today to prevent the very glints that Arakawa turned into a death sentence. The Umurbergal remains a quiet, sun-baked tomb, but local elders still claim that during the 1700 hour in September, the ridges occasionally flicker with a phantom light. They say it is the mountain remembering Arakawa's mirrors. However, recent declassified documents from a 1950s underwater survey off the coast of Peleliu suggest a far more unsettling possibility. A series of perfectly circular, metallic structures were found embedded deep in the seabed directly beneath the ridges, structures that matched the exact diameter of the hole Arakawa saw in his final moments. Stories like the broken glass trap don't just happen. They are carved out of the blood and coral of places most people can't even find on a map. While you've been watching this, the algorithms have been trying to bury this history under mindless entertainment. If you leave this video without subscribing, you're letting another piece of the Pacific War's grim reality fade into silence. Like this video if you believe these men's stories still matter, and comment Peleliu below to prove that history isn't just a thing of the past. Don't let their sacrifice be forgotten just because it's too heavy to remember.